Money is one of the oldest ideas humans have ever shared. Long before there were banks, before there were coins, before there was any writing at all, people were already finding ways to trade what they had for what they needed. And over many, many centuries, those simple trades slowly grew into something larger, a quiet agreement, shared by entire societies, that a certain object could stand in for value itself, that a small disk of metal, or a slip of paper, or a string of shells could represent a day of labor, a basket of grain, a bolt of cloth, a home. It is a strange kind of magic when you think about it slowly enough. And tonight, slowly, is exactly how we are going to think about it. Imagine a small village many thousands of years ago, long before anyone had ever held a coin or folded a banknote. In this village, there were farmers who grew grain, herders who raised goats and sheep, potters who shaped clay into bowls, and weavers who spun wool into cloth. None of these people used money, because money, as we understand it, did not yet exist. Instead, they relied on something simpler, and in some ways more complicated. They relied on each other, through direct exchange. A farmer with extra grain might trade some of it to a potter, in exchange for a clay jar. A herder might trade a goat to a weaver for a warm blanket. This is what historians and economists often call barter, the direct trading of one good or service for another, without any third object standing in between them. Barter worked well enough in small, close communities, where everyone generally knew each other, and where trust could be built slowly over years of living side by side. But barter had a quiet, persistent problem, one that economists later gave a name: the problem of the double coincidence of wants. This simply means that for a trade to happen, both people had to want exactly what the other person had to offer at exactly the same time. Imagine the farmer wants a new clay pot and finds the potter, but the potter does not want grain that season. Perhaps the potter already has plenty, or perhaps the potter wants meat instead. Now the farmer must search further, perhaps trading grain to someone else first, just to eventually get something the potter actually wants. You can imagine how slow, how uncertain, how inconvenient this could become, especially as villages grew larger and as people began trading with strangers from distant places, people whose needs and habits they did not know well. In many early societies, alongside barter, there also existed something gentler and older still: gift economies and systems of mutual obligation. In these systems, people gave goods or services to one another, not for an immediate exchange, but as part of a long, ongoing relationship of trust. A hunter might share meat with their neighbors, not expecting an instant trade in return, but trusting that when they themselves were in need, others would share with them in turn. Anthropologists have studied these systems among many cultures across the world, from the Pacific Islands to parts of Africa and the Americas, and found that long before formal money existed, human communities were already weaving complex webs of generosity, memory, and trust. In a sense, these early systems were a kind of social ledger, an unwritten book of who had given what to whom, held not on paper, but in memory and in relationship. As communities grew larger and as trade began to stretch beyond the borders of a single village, into networks connecting many villages, towns, and eventually distant regions, the limitations of barter became harder and harder to ignore. People needed something that almost everyone would accept, something portable, something that did not spoil, something whose value could be roughly agreed upon, even between strangers who might never meet again. And so, gradually, in different parts of the world, separated by oceans and mountains and centuries, human beings began to reach for similar solutions. They began to choose specific objects, objects that were rare enough to hold value, but common enough to be used in daily trade, and they slowly turned those objects into something new, something we would later come to call money. This shift did not happen all at once, in one single moment, in one single place. It happened slowly, in many places, through quiet trial and error, as different societies experimented with different solutions to the very same problem. How do we trade fairly, easily, and with people we do not fully know or trust? And it is to those early experiments, those first fragile forms of money, that we now slowly turn. Long before the first coin was ever struck from metal, human societies experimented with all kinds of objects as early forms of money. These are often called commodity money, because the object itself usually had some use or value beyond simply being traded. And yet, over time, it also came to serve as a medium of exchange, a way of measuring and storing value. One of the most famous and widespread examples is the cowrie shell. These small, smooth, glossy shells came originally from the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, particularly around the Maldive Islands. For many centuries, cowrie shells were used as currency across vast regions of Africa, Asia, and parts of Oceania. They were lightweight, durable, difficult to counterfeit, and naturally limited in supply, since they had to be gathered from particular coastal waters and then transported, sometimes thousands of miles, along ancient trade routes. In parts of West Africa, cowrie shells remained an important form of currency well into the 19th century, used in markets, in dowries, and in trade with merchants from distant lands. It is a quiet, remarkable thought that a tiny shell, gathered from a tropical seabed, could eventually be used to buy cloth or cattle in a market thousands of miles inland. In other parts of the world, salt served a similar purpose. In ancient Rome, soldiers were sometimes partly paid in salt or given an allowance to purchase it, and many historians have long believed this is the origin of the word salary, from the Latin word for salt, though this exact origin has been debated and somewhat softened over the years by historians. It remains a widely told story that nonetheless was rooted in salt's importance as a valuable trade good. Salt was precious for a very practical reason. Long before refrigeration, salt was one of the only reliable ways to preserve meat and fish, making it tremendously valuable to societies that needed to store food through long winters or long journeys. In parts of ancient Africa, large slabs of salt were used directly as currency, traded across the Sahara Desert in great caravans, exchanged for gold, ivory, and other valuable goods. Cattle, too, served as one of humanity's oldest forms of wealth and exchange. In many pastoral societies, among ancient peoples in parts of Africa, the Near East, and elsewhere, the number of cattle a family owned was a direct, visible measure of their wealth. Cattle could be used to pay debts, to provide dowries for marriage, and to settle disputes between families or clans. In fact, the very word for money in several ancient languages is closely tied to the word for cattle. In Latin, the word pecunia, meaning money, comes from pecus, the word for cattle or livestock. This linguistic thread, quietly woven through the ancient world, reminds us that for many early societies, wealth was not an abstract number, but something living, something that grazed in fields and had to be tended, fed, and protected. Other societies turned to different materials still. In parts of ancient China, before the widespread use of coins, cowrie shells were also used, and later, bronze objects shaped like small tools, miniature spades, miniature knives, began to circulate as a form of proto-currency, blending the idea of a useful object with the idea of a symbolic token of value. In the Pacific, on the island of Yap, in what is now Micronesia, communities used enormous carved stone discs, some taller than a person, known as rye stones, as a form of money. These stones were often too large and heavy to move at all once placed, yet the entire community kept track, through shared memory and oral tradition, of who owned which stone, and ownership could change hands even without physically moving the stone itself. A strikingly early example of money as an agreed-upon record, rather than a physical object that needed to change hands to change ownership. What all of these early forms of money shared was a quiet social agreement, whether it was a shell, a slab of salt, a living animal, or a carved stone. The object itself only became money because a community of people agreed, together, often without ever writing the rule down, that it could represent value and could be exchanged for other things of value. This is, in many ways, the deepest truth about money. a truth that remains just as real today as it was in those ancient villages. Money is not valuable because of what it is made of, but because of what people, together, believe and agree it represents. As trade networks grew larger and more complex, stretching across kingdoms, empires, and unfamiliar lands, societies needed something even more standardized than shells or salt or cattle, something whose value could be quickly recognized, easily divided into smaller and larger amounts, and trusted even among strangers who had never met before. This need slowly gave rise to one of the most important inventions in the history of money, the coin. Most historians trace the origin of coinage, in the form we would recognize today, to the ancient kingdom of Lydia, located in what is now Western Turkey, around the 7th century BCE. The Lydians began producing small lumps of a natural alloy called electrum, a mixture of gold and silver that occurred naturally in local riverbeds, stamped with official marks to certify their weight and purity. This was a quiet but enormous leap forward. Before this, traders had to weigh and test precious metals every single time they made a transaction, a slow and uncertain process. With stamped coins, the weight and value were guaranteed by the authority that issued them, allowing trade to move faster and allowing trust to be built into the very object being exchanged. From Lydia, the idea of coinage spread quickly across the ancient Mediterranean world. The Greek city-states, each fiercely independent, began minting their own coins, often stamped with symbols of their city or their patron gods. The Owl of Athens, representing the goddess Athena, became one of the most widely recognized and trusted coins of the ancient world, traded far beyond the borders of Athens itself, because merchants everywhere had learned to trust its weight and purity. Greek coins were often made of silver, a metal that was both relatively abundant in certain regions and yet rare enough to hold strong value. The Persian Empire, too, developed its own elaborate coinage system, including the famous gold daric, named for the Persian king Darius the Great, who ruled in the 6th century BCE. Persian coinage helped unify trade across one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever known, stretching from Egypt to the edges of India. When the Roman Republic, and later the Roman Empire, rose to dominance, they too adopted and refined the use of coinage on a massive scale. Roman coins, such as the silver denarius and later the gold solidus, circulated across an enormous territory, from Britain in the north to North Africa in the south, from Spain in the west to the edges of the Middle East in the east. Roman coins often bore the image of the reigning emperor, a quiet but powerful form of political messaging, reminding every person who held that coin, in every corner of the empire, exactly who held power over their land and their lives. In this way, coins became more than just tools of trade. They became instruments of identity, of propaganda, and of imperial authority. It is worth pausing here, slowly, to notice something remarkable. Across these ancient civilizations, Lydia, Greece, Persia, Rome, coinage developed independently in different forms, but all converged on a similar set of ideas: a standardized weight, a stamped mark of authenticity, and a guarantee, usually backed by a king, an empire, or a city-state, that the coin held a certain, trustworthy value. This guarantee, this trust, is really the quiet heart of all money, even now, even tonight, even in the digital numbers that move silently through modern bank accounts. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in ancient China, a separate and equally fascinating tradition of coinage was developing entirely on its own. As early as the Zhou dynasty, many centuries before the Common Era, Chinese metalworkers were casting bronze coins shaped like small tools, and eventually moved toward round coins with a square hole in the center, a shape that would remain remarkably consistent in Chinese currency for well over 2,000 years. The square hole allowed coins to be strung together on a cord, making it easier to carry and count large amounts at once. A simple, practical design that quietly solved a very real, everyday problem for merchants and travelers. It is a gentle thing to consider as you drift further into rest. that across vast distances, with no contact between them, ancient peoples in Lydia and ancient peoples in China arrived at strikingly similar solutions to the same deep human problem. How do we trust each other enough to trade? The answer, again and again, across cultures and centuries, was to create small, durable objects, marked with the authority of a trusted institution that everyone agreed to treat as valuable. Let us slow down even further now and wander gently through some of the great ancient civilizations to see how money and trade quietly shaped their daily lives. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now Iraq, some of the very earliest writing systems in human history were developed, and remarkably, much of that early writing was used not for poetry or storytelling, but for record keeping, tracking debts, payments, and trade. Clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform script, dating back thousands of years, recorded transactions involving silver, barley, and other goods. In fact, silver, measured carefully by weight using a unit called the shekel, became one of the most important standards of value in ancient Mesopotamia, even though, in this early period, silver was usually exchanged as weighed metal rather than as standardized coins. This is sometimes called weighed metal currency, a quiet stepping stone between simple barter and the later invention of stamped coinage. The fact that some of humanity's earliest written language was used to record economic transactions tells us something deeply important, that the need to track value, debt, and trade was, from the very beginning of written history, one of the central concerns of organized human society. In ancient Egypt, along the fertile banks of the Nile River, the economy for many centuries operated largely without coinage at all, relying instead on a sophisticated system of bartering and a unit of account called the deben, used to measure and compare the value of goods like copper, grain, and silver, even though, for much of Egyptian history, actual coins were not widely used in daily trade. Egyptian temples and the royal palace played a significant role in collecting, storing, and redistributing grain and goods, acting almost like an early form of central economic management, smoothing out the uncertainty of good harvests and bad ones across the kingdom. In ancient India, archaeological evidence shows that various forms of currency developed quite early, including small silver and copper coins, known as punch-marked coins, dating back roughly to the 6th or 7th century BCE, found across the Indian subcontinent. These coins were often stamped with simple symbols rather than detailed images, but they served the same essential purpose as coins elsewhere in the ancient world, a trusted, portable, standardized store of value. And in ancient China, as trade networks expanded along what would later become known as the Silk Road, connecting China to Central Asia, Persia, and eventually the Mediterranean world, the demand for reliable currency grew steadily. Chinese dynasties experimented with various forms of bronze coinage for centuries, and the relative stability and consistency of Chinese coin design across many dynasties allowed trade to flow more smoothly across an enormous and diverse empire. It is worth noticing, slowly, gently, how in every one of these ancient civilizations, the development of money was never separate from the development of writing, record-keeping, government, and law. Money and civilization grew up together, hand in hand, each shaping the other. As trade grew more complex, societies needed better ways to record who owed what to whom, and as record-keeping grew more sophisticated, trade itself could grow larger, reaching further, connecting more people across greater distances than ever before. As you continue to relax, let your mind wander along one of history's most remarkable trade networks, the Silk Road. This was not a single road at all, but a vast, shifting web of trade routes, stretching over land and sea, connecting China in the east to the Mediterranean world in the west, passing through Central Asia, Persia, India, and the Arabian Peninsula. For well over 1,000 years, beginning roughly around the 2nd century BCE, merchants, travelers, and goods moved slowly along these routes, carrying silk, spices, precious stones, tea, paper, and countless other goods across enormous distances. Money played a quiet but essential role in making this vast network function. Merchants traveling the Silk Road often had to exchange currencies many times along their journey, moving between different kingdoms, empires, and trading cities, each with its own coins, weights, and standards of value. This created a constant, practical need for trust, for standardized weights and measures, and eventually for early systems that resembled banking, places where merchants could deposit goods or money in one city and receive a kind of certificate or letter of credit that could be honored in another city far away, sparing them the danger and inconvenience of carrying large amounts of gold or silver across long, often perilous journeys. These early letters of credit, sometimes used by merchant communities and trading guilds, were an important and quiet step toward the much later invention of paper money and modern banking. They represented a profound shift in thinking, the idea that money did not need to be a physical object at all, carried from hand to hand, but could instead be a promise, a trusted record, an agreement between parties that value existed and could be claimed, even from a great distance. Along the Silk Road, and in the great trading cities that grew up around it, Samarkand, Baghdad, Chang'an, Constantinople, different cultures, religions, and economic systems mingled and influenced one another. Islamic civilization, flourishing especially during what is often called its Golden Age, roughly from the 8th to the 13th century, made significant contributions to trade, commerce, and early financial instruments, including sophisticated systems of credit and partnership that allowed merchants to pool resources and share risk across long trading voyages. Cities like Baghdad became thriving centers of trade, scholarship, and innovation, where ideas about money, mathematics, and commerce flowed as freely as the goods themselves. It is a peaceful thing to imagine, as your body grows heavier and your thoughts grow slower, the quiet image of a caravan moving slowly across a vast desert at dusk, camels laden with silk and spices, merchants carrying with them not just physical goods, but also ideas about trust, about credit, about how to fairly exchange value across cultures and languages that did not always share the same words, but somehow always found a way to agree on what something was worth. Now let us drift toward one of the most important and surprising chapters in the history of money, the invention of paper currency. It may seem, at first, like a small thing, a simple piece of printed paper, but the invention of paper money represents one of the most profound shifts in how human beings have ever thought about value. Paper money was first developed in China, and its roots can be traced back to the Tang dynasty, around the 7th century, when merchants began using a system of certificates known as fei qian, sometimes translated as flying money, which functioned as a kind of promissory note or letter of credit, allowing merchants to deposit money in one location and withdraw an equivalent amount in another, without having to physically transport heavy strings of bronze coins across long distances. This was not yet true paper currency in the modern sense, but it was an important and meaningful step in that direction. The true, widespread use of paper money as an actual currency, used directly in everyday trade, rather than simply as a certificate of deposit, developed more fully during the Song dynasty, beginning around the 11th century. Faced with a shortage of copper for minting coins, and the practical burden of carrying large amounts of heavy metal currency, the Song government began issuing official paper notes, known as jiaozi, which were backed by reserves of coins held by the government, and which could be exchanged for a fixed value. This was, in many ways, the world's first true government-issued paper currency, and it represented an extraordinary leap of collective trust. The idea that a thin piece of paper, worth very little in itself, could represent real, tangible value, simply because a trusted authority guaranteed that it could. Later, during the Yuan dynasty, established by the Mongol rulers who came to control China in the 13th century, paper money became even more widely used and more centrally controlled. It was during this period that the famous Venetian traveler Marco Polo journeyed through the Mongol Empire and later, in his written accounts, described with evident astonishment the Chinese system of paper currency to audiences back in Europe, who at the time had never seen or even imagined such a thing. Marco Polo described how the Great Khan's mints produced paper notes, stamped with official seals, and how these notes were treated by the people as real and valuable currency, accepted throughout the vast Mongol territories. For European readers of the time, the idea of paper functioning as money seemed almost magical, a strange and wondrous practice from a distant and little understood part of the world. It would take several more centuries before paper money became widely adopted in Europe, but the seed had been planted, carried slowly along the same trade routes that had long connected East and West. The idea that money did not need to be made of gold or silver at all, that it could instead be a trusted symbol, a promise backed by a government or institution, would eventually become one of the central pillars of the modern financial world. And it began, quietly, patiently, in China, many centuries before much of the rest of the world was ready to embrace it. As we drift gently into medieval Europe, we find a continent slowly rebuilding its trade networks after the decline of the Roman Empire, and slowly developing new financial tools to meet the needs of growing towns, growing trade fairs, and growing ambitions. One of the most important developments of this period was the rise of formal banking, particularly in the trading cities of medieval and Renaissance Italy. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa became thriving centers of commerce, connected by trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean and into the wider world. Italian merchant families, most famously the Medici family of Florence, built powerful banking institutions that did far more than simply store wealth. They extended credit to merchants, kings, and even the church, financed long trading voyages, and developed sophisticated financial instruments to manage risk across these complex and often uncertain ventures. It was in this period that many foundational tools of modern banking and accounting were developed or refined. Double-entry bookkeeping, a method of recording financial transactions that is still used by accountants and businesses around the world today, was refined and popularized in Italy during this period, most famously described in a published work by the Italian mathematician and friar Luca Pacioli in the late 15th century. This system allowed merchants to track their finances with far greater precision and clarity than ever before, recording every transaction as both a debit and a credit, helping ensure that the books always quietly balanced. The bill of exchange also became an increasingly important financial tool during this period. A bill of exchange was, in essence, a written order from one merchant to another, instructing payment of a certain sum of money to a third party, often in a different city or even a different country. This allowed merchants to settle debts and conduct trade across long distances without physically transporting large amounts of gold or silver, which was both risky and inconvenient, given the dangers of travel during this period. Bandits, storms at sea, and the simple unpredictability of long journeys. The word bank itself is believed to have come from the Italian word banca, meaning bench, referring to the benches or tables that early Italian money changers used in the marketplaces of cities like Florence and Venice, where they would sit to exchange currencies, weigh coins, and conduct early forms of lending and deposit-taking. Meanwhile, across Europe, other powerful institutions also played a role in shaping the early financial world. The Knights Templar, a religious and military order founded during the era of the Crusades, developed what some historians describe as one of the earliest forms of an international banking network, allowing pilgrims and travelers heading to the Holy Land to deposit funds in one location, such as in Europe, and withdraw an equivalent amount in another location, such as in the Holy Land itself, using a system of letters and secure verification, reducing the very real danger of carrying large amounts of gold across long and dangerous pilgrimage routes. In the centuries that followed, the financial innovations developed in medieval and Renaissance Europe, formal banks, double-entry bookkeeping, bills of exchange, and eventually the first stock exchanges and chartered trading companies, would slowly spread and evolve, laying important groundwork for the modern global financial system that would emerge in the centuries to come. Let your breathing settle even further now, slow and even, as we drift toward the age of exploration, a period beginning in the late 15th century, when European sailors, driven by a hunger for trade, wealth, and new routes to the riches of Asia, set out across unfamiliar oceans in wooden ships, often uncertain of what, if anything, they might find. This era reshaped the history of money in profound and far-reaching ways. When Spanish explorers arrived in the Americas, they encountered, and eventually took control of, extraordinarily rich deposits of silver and gold, particularly in regions of what is now Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia. The silver mines of Potosí, high in the mountains of present-day Bolivia, became legendary for their staggering output, and over the following centuries, enormous quantities of silver were extracted, often through extremely harsh and exploitative labor conditions imposed upon indigenous populations, a painful and important part of this history that deserves to be remembered honestly alongside the economic story. This silver was minted into coins, most famously the Spanish silver dollar, also known as the piece of 8, which became one of the most widely circulated and trusted currencies in the entire world for several centuries. The Spanish dollar was used not only throughout the vast Spanish Empire, but also became a standard trading currency across much of the world, including in early colonial North America, where it circulated widely, even among English colonists, long before the United States developed its own currency. In fact, the very symbol we use today for the American dollar, the dollar sign, is believed by many historians to have evolved from a stylized version of the symbol once used to represent the Spanish peso, or piece of 8. This massive influx of silver and gold from the Americas into Europe, and from there into trade networks stretching across Asia, including major trade with China, dramatically reshaped global economic patterns. Some historians describe this period as an early form of globalization, as silver mined in the mountains of South America made its way, through long and complex trading chains, all the way to markets in China, where silver was in tremendously high demand, partly to meet tax obligations that the Chinese government required to be paid in silver. This enormous flow of precious metal also had significant and sometimes difficult consequences for the economies it touched. In parts of Europe, the sudden influx of so much silver and gold contributed to a long period of inflation, sometimes referred to by historians as the price revolution, during which the prices of goods rose steadily over many decades, reshaping economic life across the continent. It is a useful and important reminder, even now, that the value of money is never entirely fixed or simple. It shifts and responds to the deeper currents of supply, trade, and human behavior, currents that often move slowly and quietly beneath the surface of everyday life, much like the slow tide carrying you now toward sleep. As trade and economies grew larger and more complex across Europe, a new kind of financial institution slowly began to emerge: the central bank. Unlike earlier merchant banks, which primarily served private trade and commerce, central banks were created to manage a nation's money supply, support government finances, and bring a greater degree of stability and trust to a country's currency as a whole. One of the earliest and most influential examples is the Bank of England, founded in 1694. It was established in part to help the English government raise funds to finance a costly war, and in exchange for lending money to the government, the bank was granted significant privileges, including the right to issue banknotes. Over time, the Bank of England grew into one of the most important and trusted financial institutions in the world, helping to stabilize the British economy and supporting the growth of London as a major global center of finance and trade. Other nations gradually developed their own central banking systems as well, each shaped by their own unique history and circumstances. Sweden's Sveriges Riksbank, founded in 1668, is often cited as the oldest central bank still in existence today. France, the Netherlands, and other European nations also developed their own central financial institutions over the following centuries, as governments increasingly recognized the importance of having a stable, trusted system for managing currency and supporting national economic activity. In the young United States, the path toward a stable national currency and a central banking system was, for many decades, a winding and contested one. The very first attempts at a national bank, including the first Bank of the United States, chartered in 1791, under the guidance of Alexander Hamilton, and later the Second Bank of the United States, were both eventually allowed to expire amid intense political debate about the proper role of centralized financial power within a young democracy. For much of the 19th century, the United States operated without a true central bank, relying instead on a patchwork of state-chartered banks, each issuing its own banknotes, leading to a confusing and often unstable financial landscape, where the value and trustworthiness of a banknote might vary significantly depending on which bank had issued it and how far one traveled from that bank's home region. It was not until 1913, after several serious financial panics had shaken public confidence in the banking system, that the United States Congress established the Federal Reserve System, the central banking system that continues to manage the nation's currency and broader monetary policy today. The creation of the Federal Reserve was intended to provide greater stability, to act as a lender of last resort during financial crises, and to bring a more unified, trustworthy structure to the American financial system. As you continue to relax, let it settle gently into your mind that the rise of central banks represented an important and quiet shift in how societies thought about money. Money was no longer simply a private matter between merchants and traders. It became something woven directly into the structure of nations themselves, something that governments and central institutions worked carefully to protect, stabilize, and manage, on behalf of the millions of ordinary people whose daily lives depended on it. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, many of the world's major economies organized their currencies around a system known as the gold standard. Under this system, a country's currency was directly linked to a fixed amount of gold, meaning that paper money could, at least in principle, be exchanged for a specific, guaranteed quantity of gold held by the government or central bank. Britain was among the earliest nations to formally adopt the gold standard, doing so in the early 19th century, and as British economic and trading power expanded across the world during this period, many other nations gradually adopted similar gold-based systems, partly to make international trade and finance more predictable and stable. When multiple countries are all linked to gold at fixed rates, it becomes much easier to know, with reasonable confidence, what one country's currency is worth compared to another's, smoothing the path for international trade and investment. The gold standard offered a sense of stability and discipline. Because currency was tied to a tangible, limited resource, governments faced real constraints on how much money they could print, which many economists at the time believed helped prevent runaway inflation and encouraged more careful, disciplined economic policy. However, the gold standard also came with significant limitations and challenges. Because the money supply was tied closely to gold reserves, countries sometimes found it difficult to respond flexibly to economic downturns, financial crises, or sudden need for increased spending, such as during major wars. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 placed enormous financial strain on many of the world's major economies, and most nations involved in the war were forced to suspend or abandon strict adherence to the gold standard, printing additional currency to help finance the tremendous costs of the conflict. In the years following the war, many countries attempted to return to the gold standard, hoping to restore the pre-war sense of financial stability. However, this period of return proved difficult and in many cases ultimately unsustainable. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, placed enormous strain on economies around the world, and the rigid constraints of the gold standard made it especially difficult for governments to respond effectively to the deep economic suffering of the period. One by one, throughout the 1930s, major countries began to abandon the gold standard, allowing their governments greater flexibility to manage their currencies and respond to economic crises. This slow, difficult unwinding of the gold standard set the stage for an entirely new chapter in the history of international money, one that would be formally established in the aftermath of an even larger global conflict. As the Second World War drew toward its end, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered in July of 1944 at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the United States, to design a new international monetary system, one intended to help prevent the kind of economic instability and financial chaos that had contributed to the hardships of the pre-war years. The agreement that emerged from this gathering, known as the Bretton Woods Agreement, established a new framework for international finance. Under this system, the United States dollar was directly linked to gold at a fixed rate, while other major currencies were, in turn, linked to the United States dollar at fixed exchange rates. This created a kind of modified gold standard, with the dollar sitting at the very center of the global financial system, reflecting the immense economic strength of the United States in the years following the war. The Bretton Woods Conference also led to the creation of two important international institutions that continue to play significant roles in the global economy today: the International Monetary Fund, often known as the IMF, designed to help maintain international monetary cooperation and provide financial support to countries facing balance of payments difficulties, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which would later become part of the broader World Bank Group, designed initially to help finance the rebuilding of war-torn economies, and later to support broader global development efforts. For roughly the next quarter century, the Bretton Woods system provided a significant degree of stability to international trade and finance, supporting a remarkable period of global economic growth in the decades following the war. However, by the late 1960s and early 1970s, the system began to face significant strain. The United States, facing rising government spending, including the costs associated with the Vietnam War and various domestic programs, found it increasingly difficult to maintain the fixed link between the dollar and gold, as more and more dollars circulated around the world relative to the actual gold reserves held by the United States government. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would suspend the direct convertibility of the dollar into gold, an event that later became widely known as the Nixon shock. This decision effectively brought the Bretton Woods system to an end and ushered in a new era, one in which the value of major world currencies would no longer be directly tied to gold at all, but would instead be allowed to float, their value determined primarily by the forces of international supply, demand, and market trust, rather than by a fixed, tangible link to a precious metal. This shift marked one of the most significant moments in the entire history of money. For the first time in the modern era, the major currencies of the world were what economists call fiat currencies, meaning their value rested not on a promise of gold or silver, but simply on the trust, confidence, and collective agreement of the people, businesses, and governments who used them every day. It was, in many ways, a return to that same quiet truth we touched on earlier in our story, that money has always, ultimately, been a matter of shared belief and trust, even when, for many centuries, that trust was symbolically anchored to a particular shining metal pulled from the earth. As the 20th century moved into its later decades, the very form of money itself began to change once again, this time becoming less and less physical and more electronic, abstract, and invisible. Credit cards, though their earliest forms date back to department store charge cards in the early 20th century, became much more widely used and standardized in the latter half of the century. The Diners Club card, introduced in 1950, is often credited as one of the first modern multi-purpose charge cards, allowing members to pay for meals and services at a variety of participating businesses, with a single monthly bill settling the accumulated charges. This was followed in the coming years and decades by the development of major credit card networks, allowing people to make purchases without carrying physical cash at all, instead relying on a small plastic card linked to an account, with the actual movement of money happening quietly, electronically, behind the scenes. At the same time, banking itself was steadily becoming more electronic. The development of computer systems in the mid to late 20th century allowed banks to process transactions, transfers, and records far more quickly and efficiently than the older systems of paper ledgers and manual bookkeeping. Automated teller machines, commonly known as ATMs, began appearing in the late 1960s and became widespread in the decades that followed, allowing people to withdraw cash and check their balances at any hour, without needing to visit a bank teller in person. The rise of the internet in the 1990s brought yet another profound transformation to the world of money. Online banking allowed people to manage their finances from their own homes, checking balances, paying bills, and transferring funds with just a few clicks. E-commerce platforms made it possible to buy goods and services from sellers on the other side of the world, with payment processed instantly through electronic networks. Digital payment services continued to evolve in the years that followed, making it increasingly possible to send and receive money instantly, often without ever touching a physical coin or banknote at all. By the early 21st century, for a great many people around the world, especially in wealthier nations, money had become something largely abstract: a number on a screen, a brief notification on a phone, a quiet, invisible flow of value moving through vast networks of computers and servers. Far removed from the cowrie shells, salt slabs, and silver coins of earlier centuries, and yet, in its quiet essence, still resting on that very same ancient foundation: trust, shared belief, and the simple human agreement that this number, this entry, this small glowing notification truly represents something of value. In the final years of the first decade of the 21st century, against the backdrop of a serious global financial crisis that shook trust in many traditional banking institutions, a new and quite different kind of money began to emerge. In 2008, a paper was published under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, describing a new system called Bitcoin, a form of digital currency that did not rely on any central bank, government, or financial institution to manage or verify it. Instead, Bitcoin proposed using a decentralized network of computers and a public, shared, continuously verified record of transactions, known as a blockchain, to allow people to send and receive value directly with one another, with the integrity of the system maintained collectively by the network itself, rather than by a single trusted authority. The first actual Bitcoin transactions began in early 2009, and in the years that followed, Bitcoin slowly grew from an obscure experiment, known mainly to a small community of computer scientists and early enthusiasts, into a widely recognized, if still controversial, and often highly volatile, form of digital asset. Following Bitcoin's emergence, many other cryptocurrencies were developed, each with their own particular features, goals, and underlying technology, contributing to a broader and rapidly evolving digital asset ecosystem. It is worth noting, gently and honestly, that cryptocurrencies remain a genuinely debated and evolving part of the financial world. Their prices have historically shown significant volatility, rising and falling sharply over relatively short periods of time. Governments and regulators around the world have taken, and continue to take, a wide range of different approaches toward cryptocurrencies, from cautious acceptance to significant restriction, and the long-term role that cryptocurrencies will ultimately play within the broader global financial system remains an open and ongoing question, one that economists, policymakers, and technologists continue to study and debate. What is interesting, from the quiet, historical perspective we have been slowly tracing tonight, is how cryptocurrency represents, in some ways, a new chapter in that very same ancient story we began with. The story of human beings searching for new and better ways to establish trust between strangers in order to exchange value fairly and reliably. Where ancient societies once relied on the physical scarcity of shells or precious metal, and where governments later relied on official stamps, central banks, and legal authority, cryptocurrency attempts something different, relying instead on shared mathematical verification and a distributed network, in an effort to create trust without needing any single central authority at all. Whether or not this particular approach endures in its current form over the coming decades, it reflects that same deep, ancient, very human pattern, stretching all the way back to the cowrie shells and salt slabs of our earlier story, the patient, ongoing search for new ways to trust one another, enough to trade. As our long, slow journey draws gently toward its close, let us take a few final, quiet moments to consider where the story of money may be headed next, while being careful, as we have tried to be throughout this journey, to describe only what is genuinely known, rather than to speculate too boldly about an uncertain future. In recent years, a number of central banks around the world have begun seriously exploring the development of what are known as central bank digital currencies, sometimes abbreviated as CBDCs. These would be digital forms of a country's official currency, issued and backed directly by the central bank itself, distinct from existing cryptocurrencies, which are not typically issued or controlled by any government. Several countries have already begun piloting or researching such systems, though as of now, their eventual scale, design, and adoption around the world remains very much an ongoing and evolving area of policy and research, rather than a fully settled matter. At the same time, the broader trend toward digital and electronic payments, already well underway for decades, continues to grow steadily in many parts of the world, with some countries seeing a significant decline in the everyday use of physical cash, even as cash, for many people and in many regions, remains an important and valued part of daily economic life, particularly for those who may not have easy access to digital banking services. Whatever specific forms money takes in the years and decades ahead, the deep, underlying story we have followed tonight is likely, in its essence, to continue. Human beings will keep searching, quietly and patiently, for better ways to trust one another, to record value fairly, and to exchange the fruits of their labor across distances, cultures, and generations. From a handful of cowrie shells gathered on a tropical shore, to a slab of salt carried across a vast desert, to a stamped silver coin passed from hand to hand in an ancient marketplace, to a folded paper note backed by the promise of a government, to a quiet, glowing number on a screen. The form has always changed, slowly, gradually, across the centuries. But underneath all of those changing forms lies that same simple, ancient, deeply human truth we began with, many sections ago, when your eyes were still open and your mind was still alert. Money is not really about the object itself. It never has been. It is about trust. It is about the quiet agreements human beings make with one another, across kitchen tables and marketplaces and oceans and centuries. Agreements that allow us to share, to trade, and to build lives together. Before we settle into our closing words, let us linger a little longer in the soft, unhurried space of this story, because one of the gentlest truths about the history of money is that its older chapters rarely vanish completely. They simply fade into the background, quietly persisting alongside whatever new system has come to dominate, like the faint outline of an old path still visible beneath a newer road. Consider, for a moment, that barter never truly disappeared, even after coins, paper money, and digital banking became widespread. In many parts of the world today, informal trade and direct exchange of goods and services still take place quietly within families, small communities, and even among businesses, especially during times of economic hardship, when trust in formal currency may weaken, or when access to banking is limited. Anthropologists studying rural economies in various parts of the world have documented how barter, far from being a primitive relic, confined only to the ancient past, can resurface as a practical and resilient tool whenever formal systems falter. Likewise, commodity money, the kind built from shells, salt, or precious metal, has never entirely vanished either. Gold, in particular, has retained a special and enduring role in the modern financial world, even long after most countries abandoned the gold standard. Central banks around the world continue to hold significant reserves of gold today, not because their currencies are directly tied to it any longer, but because gold has, for thousands of years, carried a quiet, deeply rooted reputation as a stable store of value, especially during times of economic uncertainty. Individual investors, too, often turn to gold during periods of financial stress, a habit that stretches back, quietly, unbroken, to the earliest river-panned nuggets, weighed out in ancient Mesopotamian marketplaces. Coins themselves, though now often a minor part of daily transactions in many wealthier nations, still circulate widely around the world, particularly in regions where digital payment infrastructure remains limited, or where small, everyday transactions are simply easier to manage with a handful of physical change. And paper money, despite centuries of prediction that it might soon be replaced entirely by digital alternatives, remains, even now, an important and trusted part of economic life for billions of people, valued for its simplicity, its privacy, and its reliability, even when electricity, networks, or digital systems fail. There is something quietly comforting in this layered, overlapping nature of monetary history. It reminds us that progress, in the story of money, has rarely meant a clean and total replacement of what came before. Instead, it has meant a slow accumulation of choices, a widening of options, each new tool taking its place alongside the old ones, rather than erasing them entirely. The cowrie shell gave way to the coin, but did not vanish from human memory or use entirely for many centuries afterward. The coin gave way, in places, to paper money, yet coins still jingle quietly in pockets and drawers around the world tonight, even as you rest. Paper money has, in many places, begun to give way to digital transactions, yet banknotes still rest quietly in wallets, drawers, and cash registers across the globe. Perhaps this is one of the most peaceful lessons this long, slow story has to offer, as we drift now toward its final words. Change, even profound change, rarely arrives all at once, sweeping everything before it away. It arrives slowly, gently, layer upon layer, the old quietly resting beneath the new, much like the slow layers of sleep now settling gently over you, one soft layer at a time, each one a little deeper, a little heavier, a little more peaceful than the one before. And now, as we reach the gentle end of this long, slow journey through the history of money, there is nothing left to do but rest. You do not need to remember the names of ancient kingdoms, or the dates of old agreements, or the details of distant currencies. You only need to let your body remain heavy, your breathing remain slow, and your mind continue to drift, gently, the way a coin once drifted from hand to hand along an ancient trade route, the way a shell once drifted across a calm tropical sea, the way a piece of paper once drifted quietly from a merchant's hand to a banker's ledger. Let every part of you soften now. Let the room around you grow quiet and still. There is nothing to solve tonight, nothing to figure out, nothing to remember. Just the slow, steady rhythm of your own breath, in and out, carrying you gently, the way countless quiet centuries have carried this old and patient story of money, all the way to this very moment, here, now, in the soft darkness, as you finally, fully, let go, and drift into a deep and peaceful sleep.